It's time for us to talk about the challenges. During our second round, our three topics this time to address will be whether there is a potential right balance between traveling faster and farther and the cost for the people and for the planet, how the actions of the happy few impact the freedom of mobility of others, and whether universal freedom of mobility is desirable. Carlos, we're going to start with you first this time. As we shift from fossil fuels to electrification, will our planet be able to provide enough scarce resources to ensure sustainable mobility for its 7 or 8 billion inhabitants?
It's indeed a question for which I am afraid we don't have the answer yet. What is clear is that the scarcity of resources and the fragmentation of the world with regional regulations, which are not global regulations, may have an impact in the cost inflation of raw materials. And that is going to bring us back to the affordability question that was raised previously. Even in a clean, safe mode of mobility, which has been discussed and the goal for the industry. So assuming that it is clean and safe, how do we protect affordability and how do we bring this mobility to the highest possible number of citizens it's going to be the big challenge. Right now, the affordability is not there because the raw materials are scarce and very expensive, and I would add very volatile. So it's going to be a significant challenge, starting with lithium, but not only on lithium, because so far research is so vivid that we can anticipate that the chemistry of battery cells for electric vehicles is going to change over the next few years, and rightly so, to reduce the overweight of EVs and bring the weight and cost of batteries to a more reasonable number. So we don't even know today what will be the final raw materials that will be needed from those efficient batteries that will come by the end of this decade. For the time being, we know that we need lithium. We know that we are not producing as much as we need. We have right now 1.3 billion cars which are internal combustion engine powered on the planet. We need to replace that with clean mobility. That will need a lot of lithium. Not only the lithium may not be enough, but the concentration of the mining of lithium may create other geopolitical issues. So what we should say here, Cecilia, is that not only we don't know yet what will be the final raw materials that we will need, because right now this research is still at the beginning. We are just starting this new industry, and therefore we don't know what the final raw materials will be. But if we were to know those materials, and if we take the example of today's lithium, we can anticipate that fragmenting the world with the local regulations is going to make things more difficult in terms of protecting the affordability of those raw materials that will then protect the affordability of the mobility tool, which is what is coming out of the Western world regulations. The Western world regulations have already decided what is the appropriate technology. It is not the car makers that decided to go electric, it is the regulator that decided to go electric, which then brings the question of energy. Is it clean? Is it abundant? The question of raw materials. Is it abundant, or are we fragmenting the world in a way that is going to make it scarce and therefore impact affordability and therefore impact the positive effect on the global warming fixing? This is what we can say, and we could also say the same for the rare earth elements that we need in our electric motors, which are also scarce resources for which the total amount of availability on this planet is yet to be discovered.
Thank you for that, Carlos. Måns, I want you to jump in here. How do you think the increase in climate-friendly transport is affecting its accessibility?
Yeah, I think this is the key question. You know, there are several ways of addressing transportation contribution to climate change. We have efficiency, we've had done a lot of work in different modes, including cars, improving efficiency. We have shifting modes to public transport, walking, cycling, etc. We have bioenergy, we have electrification. But the challenge with electrification is the accessibility. And if I focus in a little bit on that, if we look here in Northern Europe, for example, it is the socio-demographic groups that are higher risk for poverty and social exclusion. They also hold the largest share of transport emissions of CO2 today. And this is also because people that live in less densely populated areas are more dependent on cars and don't have other alternatives. So for example, policies like banning internal combustion engines would be highly problematic for these groups. And electric vehicles have to get much cheaper to be affordable for these groups. And I think in rural areas, of course, there are developments with battery developments that will help address the concerns about range. But there's also a kind of a global dimension to this. Now, the EU and the US is pushing kind of new industrial policy and climate policy together with the Inflation Reduction Act and the European Green Deal and the industry, clean industry regulations. It is about friendshoring and securing value chain and pushing very hard on kind of taking care of the resources, for example, recycling the batteries in the cars. But we should know that according to, for example, the United Nations, 60% of all cars that are imported to Africa today are used vehicles. And when we tighten the rules on regulations such as reusing materials, it can actually mean reducing the flow of these cars that are providing more affordable mobility. And it's also slowing the uptake on electric vehicles in these countries, which also means we're not spreading the benefits of clean, local, better air quality, for example. So there are these risks of unintentional side effects when we're forcing things like recycling instead of second use due to the EU developing policy that are kind of closing down on trade and regulate. So it's a very complex issue, actually, how the global inclusion of more clean, affordable mobility will play out in the current industrial climate.
Thank you for that. And if I connect that back to between what Carlos said and what you just said, we're talking about a need for more inclusive thinking, right? Carlos just mentioned it's not just about the electric vehicles, but we need to think about our energy sources. And you mentioned our need to think about actions that might actually benefit one part of the world, actually have a negative consequence on others, making it difficult. So we see that our inclusive thinking is what's really important as we wrestle with this topic. So Tammy, I'd like you to jump in. What are the implications around the world of the relatively high levels of mobility that exist within developed countries? Tammy, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I had to mute myself. According to the UN Habitat, over 92% of the EU's urban population has convenient access to public transportation. The realities are not the same for every country, for every continent. For example, in Africa, that number just goes up to 32, and in Asia, it's just about 38%. So while there is a group or set of people in certain countries who have access to these things in a high rate, and then there is a side effect to the usage of these things, another continent is bearing the brunt. So the implications for these things is that while it's being used in certain places in a very consistent way that produce different effects, the effect is not just in that location, it's also in different locations in Asia, in Africa, and different parts of the world. And the issue here is that, we also have the case where the development issues in this certain continent, or the least developed countries, they're different. We're still talking about access to health, access to, food, access to, employment. So some of these issues are probably not on the country's agenda 1 to 10, right? So when we're talking about these things, the implications sometimes, is the fact that these countries bear the brunt and don't have the capacity to be able to manage and adapt. And the other thing is that when rules are made, when treaties are being signed, it doesn't put into consideration the realities of these people. So we're talking about carbon emission, decarbonization, but we forget that, they might not have the capacity to be able to, create the solutions that the world has put in place, or even move up to the ladder of the solutions that have been put in place. So when we're talking about mobility and decarbonization, it's very important that the human side is being put in consideration, because the realities of a young African is very different from the realities of somebody from a developed countries, based on access to mobility and increased access to other alternatives that are probably expensive, that's not that affordable in other continents.
Thanks for that, Tammy. And Davish, what are the conflicting objectives in poorer communities regarding mobility?
Thank you for that interesting but difficult question. The first point that I would like to touch upon is that the poorer communities have to shoulder the responsibility of clean climate, right? Like all of us, because we also heard one of our friend telling that the future generation might sue us, that you didn't give us a good earth. So it doesn't matter developed countries or developing countries, rich country or a poor country, all citizens, all globizens are forced to share the responsibility of clean climate. But in rural side, the problem is that the right mode of mobility itself is not available. So on one side, we are putting that responsibility on them that, you need to have a better earth, but we are not giving them that, the right mode of mobility. So that is one conflicting objective. Second thing, responsible mobility versus excess transport. Today we can see that whether it is goods or people, there's excess transport that is happening. If we develop local economies, why do we have a necessity to even transport so much? I develop the local economy and I have a circular economy of energy and economy that will ensure that I have only bare minimal mobility. Whereas we are looking into, moving things of huge volume from one place to another. Now, last point, the biggest conflict that we are going to face is that vehicles dumping. I think we partially touched upon it. Developed countries to developing countries. Developed country is going to get into a smarter vehicle energy-wise. Then all the production lines that are still existing, they are still going to make vehicles, and that will be pushed to developing countries or underdeveloped countries. Similarly, in urban areas, we will have more electric vehicle, and the fossil fuel based vehicle will be dumped in the rural area. So that is going to be a very big dilemma. So the fundamental question comes back is that, is there really a freedom of mobility, or we are forced to choose between whatever is the unoptimized solution in the name of mobility? Therefore, all our solutions must have basis on right to, like we have right to speech, we should have right to responsible and gender inclusive mobility. Because in India, women don't get enough mobility options either. It's the men who have the vehicle. So that is also a very important angle, that gender inclusion we need to bring into this responsible mobility. With that, I end my.
Thank you for that. And that's an interesting perspective that we haven't talked about yet. We talked about geographic differences, we've talked about socioeconomic, but we didn't and youth, but we haven't necessarily talked about gender. So appreciate that. So Ben, what are some of the broader life implications of freedom of mobility in the countries that you've studied?
Yeah, I will go back to my things of how do we provide freedom of mobility. And I think what we at WRI often tout is we need to provide more access to opportunities, jobs, education, healthcare, services. However, our research has showed that in cities like Johannesburg in South Africa or Mexico City, up to half or even more of residents do not have access to these opportunities without having to travel more than 60 minutes. So that's a huge chunk of time out of people's days. Now, time is both money and sacrifice of not being able to care for others, for family, visiting friends, reaching your job, and other economic opportunities. So this has actually a key connection, however, with the elements I mentioned earlier, reducing those 1.3 million road fatalities we see every year, reducing carbon emissions on the road. If we can provide more equal access to opportunities through public transport systems, safe walking and cycling conditions, and yes, some room for mobility for the private car, but not a dependence on the private car. I will just note one final statistic, and that's that the carbon budget that we have, right? So we're seeking to basically phase out internal combustion engine vehicles by 2035. These are new regulations being put down by several countries. However, what I mentioned again, the IPCC report, we're already at 1.1 degrees warming. We're at 2023 right now. What's going to happen by 2030? We do not have enough time because it takes time to turn over vehicle fleets. And it also takes time to clean up energy sources. Because of this, there needs to be significant investment in increasing support for public transport systems, cycling and walking. These are solutions that we have had for years that are low carbon. And by doing so, we can increase people's equal access to opportunity, as well as make conditions safer for people using streets, not just a few.
Thank you for that, Ben. Something interesting that you talked about, the 60-minute commute. It's quite interesting that in some developed countries in urban areas, people are making choices about where they live to use carbon-intensive transport for longer and longer commutes. So very interesting when it's a choice versus when it's forced in terms of how much mobility you have. Thank you for that. Yamina, is freedom of mobility something that we should consider as desirable, or is it something more?
Oh, the right mobility should be a right for all of us, no matter how much income do you have. But then the answer to this mobility, again, is not, as shown by the experience in developed countries in the last century, is not by individual cars. So it's definitely not the answer. And what usually we discuss is the technological improvement of the cars. But this is the solution that exists already. So either moving to electric cars, the electric vehicles, or improving the efficiency of the existing vehicles, things like that. In the last IPCC report, we introduced the concept of sufficiency. Sufficiency is all the policy measures and the daily practices that avoid upfront. The word upfront is not in the definition, the IPCC definition, but it means upfront. We meant upfront. The demand for all natural resources, including energy, material, water, and land, while providing well-being for all within the planetary boundaries. Unfortunately, sufficiency policies are lacking in most of the climate policy packages that we have. In the NDCs, for example, you don't have NDCs are the nationally determined contributions that governments submit under the UNFCCC framework. They are lacking sufficiency policies. But we do have some examples about how to make more mobility, how to deliver on mobility as a right. So in Paris City, for example, Paris City started working on new framework, which is the 15-minute city. 15-minute city, this means all the basic needs are accessible to you in 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, you don't need a car for that. So it's either by walking, by public transport, or by cycling. But to do that, this means that the city has to invest in reshuffling the city, because Paris City was first designed without cars, because it was designed before the car industry was here. And then it has been reshuffled for the car industry, given that France is a producer of cars. And now the city is reshuffling again. Again, it's public investment to make the city, to modernize the city, because this is the way to modernize the city. The 21st century is not about more cars. The 21st century is about more people in cars. And this means less cars, and this means less profit for the car industry and the infrastructure industry. And this requires a paradigm shift in the business model for the current players. And this is, there is a country, we are locked in developed countries, we are locked in the car dependency solutions. And that's why we try to improve the car dependency solutions. But the car dependency has so many negative impacts that we should get out of the car dependency, and we should avoid locking the rest of the world in car dependency in our model, because by locking the rest of the world in our model, that is not sustainable model from environmental perspective, social and economic perspective, then the 1.5 degree target will be out of reach. So my point is that make mobility right in all countries, and provide rethinking mobility first as need, and then we can look to the solutions and try to improve the solutions. And more
Great.
cars is not for the 21st century.
Great. Thank you for that, Yumina. And before I wrap up this, I would like to open it up again to the debaters. Mons, will you start us off with comments on this?
Sure. I think we talk a lot about the need to find another mobility paradigm, so to speak. And I do think that there's a point there that our 20th century Western mobility paradigm with personal cars in the center might not be the paradigm of the future. And we see that amongst young people today, also in Western society, and amongst young people in the global South, in many places, where we have a bigger ecosystem of options outside just the personal car, with buses, minibuses, three-wheelers, etc., bicycles. And we see it in cities such as Nairobi and New Delhi, but we also see how cities in Europe, for example, make it more and more difficult to have a car, commute with a car into the city, which is obviously shifting the balance of when you make your choice, so to speak.
Great.
So if there's nowhere to park, people would need to find other options. And I think this is a trend that we're going to keep seeing, also because of the space that we had in the first intervention, the space of the city. What is it used for? And the value of that space is more than just being a sort of a deposit for cars that are not running. So I do think there's a real need for personal individual cars also in the future, but I think we are in the process now of having a more balanced view, and I think the generational shift and the shift to the rapidly growing cities around the world is sort of accelerating this change.
Thank you for that. Carlos, why don't you jump in?
Yeah, thank you, Cecilia. I just would like to comment on a couple of things. First, from Devesh and Ben's comments, I think we should not forget that mobility is about access to health, education, and jobs. And while I clearly support the fact that you can find solutions for the urban areas, we should be mindful of the fact that still 40% of the world population is not living in urban areas so far. So you can imagine a specific solution for the urban areas, but if you are talking about rural areas, access to health, to education and jobs needs possibly a different way of addressing mobility needs. I don't think that humanity is ready to give up on individual mobility. I don't think there is any consensus on that. I think that we just have to find the ways to keep that individual mobility safe, clean and affordable from one side, recognizing that if in the urban areas we want to give back the space to the pedestrians and the cyclists, that's very fine, because indeed you can access many things with a highly dense area of population. That's possible. It may not mean that this is the best way to enjoy life, but that's what can be in the mind of some people. But in the rural areas, you still need to address the individual needs to access health, education, and jobs. And for those needs, you have to find a way to make it clean, safe, and affordable at the end of the day.
Thank you. Yamina, I think you wanted to jump in again.
Yeah, I would like to jump in about this rural area issue because we usually think about public transport only the way we know it in cities. So you have metro, you have tram, you have buses, etc. But actually, there are solutions already implemented in rural to address the mobility needs in rural area, which is, for example, carpooling that provides the same service like the metro service that you have in cities. So there are these solutions already implemented. So for example, in France, there is a company like Eco, for example, who is already providing these solutions in rural areas. So it's not because you are located in rural area that your mobility needs will be hindered. They are hindered today. Today, the problem, all the mobility issues are related to the fact that we made car dependency as a solution, as the main answer to our mobility need. This is the challenge that we have. We need to get out of this paradigm. And it applies for urban areas, it applies for rural areas. It does not apply in the same way, but there are solutions for both type of organizations.
Thank you for that, Yamina. So in this sequence, we've had quite a debate. We've clearly established that we need to have mobility from a needs perspective, but that it varies quite differently depending upon where you are from a geographic perspective and what your needs are. The modes are very different. And clearly, the debate is on in terms of the role of cars. We know that they're a dominant solution today. How do we balance that with the other modes is something that we're really going to have to work to create the balance between all of those options. So thank you very much for that debate, because it's very interesting. The local challenges and the local solutions are actually creating some global challenges, and the global aspirations are creating some local challenges. So it's very interesting that it works in both directions.